Well, welcome everybody. Really pleased that everybody was able to make it today, and from very far away, some of you. The topic of our conference today is the state of exception. The concept was originated by Carl Schmitt in his book Political Theology from 1922. Recently, it was revisited in an important philosophical work by Giorgio Agamben in 2005, entitled The State of Exception. Schmitt postulated the state of exception, also known as the state of emergency, not merely, as is typically imagined, as a suspension of ordinary law during a time of civil disturbance in order to ensure the public safety, but for Schmitt, the ability to declare a state of emergency and suspend the law is the act that constitutes sovereign power. Schmitt declared famously, "Sovereign is he who decides on the exception." And notice it's he. Schmitt's ominous formulation might have been an obscure footnote in legal history, were it not that he was the principal architect of Article 48 of the Constitution of the Weimar Republic. An article which reads, "If public order and security are seriously disturbed or endangered within the Federation, the President may take all necessary steps for their restoration. He may suspend for the time being, either wholly or in part, the fundamental rights described in the Constitution." On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag fire damaged the House of Parliament in Berlin. Claiming that the fire was the first step in a communist revolution, the Nazis used the pretext to get President von Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. Under the decree issued by von Hindenburg on the basis of Article 48, the government was given the authority to curtail constitutional rights, including habeas corpus, free expression, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, privacy of postal, telegraph, and telephone communications. Constitutional restrictions on searches and confiscations of property were likewise suspended. Further, the President was given the power to issue emergency decrees to protect the Republic from crises initiated by its opponents. The Reichstag fire decree was never repealed. Over 12 years, Hitler used Article 48 to give his dictatorship a veneer of legal credibility. As Giorgio Agamben writes, during Hitler's 12 years in power, Germany could be said to have existed in a state of exception. To some extent, it could be argued that it was the state of exception that, as Schmitt envisaged, constituted Hitler's sovereign power. In other words, in some sense, Hitler's ability to wield power was born out of Schmitt's notion of political theology. In our own time, Schmitt's state of exception cannot be set at a safe historical distance. As Mark Danner from the New York Review of Books writes regarding the post-9/11 era in America, but I think it also applies to Europe, call it then the state of exception. These years during which, in the name of security, some of our accustomed rights and freedoms are circumscribed or set aside. The years during which we live in a different time. The different time of ours has now extended 10 years. This was in 2011. The longest by far in American history, with little sense of an ending. Indeed, the very endlessness of this state of exception is evidence of its increased normalization. And now, with the Paris attacks, events have caught up with our conference in a way that we couldn't have envisaged. The original state of emergency in Paris, in France, declared after the terrorist attack, was recently extended to 2 months. And France is currently, for the first time since World War II, in a state of emergency. Among the emergency measures that violate human rights today are the establishment of Guantanamo Bay detention camp, drone strikes which are used for extrajudicial executions, government-sponsored abduction and extrajudicial transfer of people to nations known to practice torture. This has been perpetrated by America hundreds of times. Warrantless surveillance of private emails, Skype chats, and other online communications. The establishment of sex offender registries and so-called medical facilities like Coalinga in California, in which sex offenders who have served a lawful sentence are later detained indefinitely, a kind of infinite justice, until they successfully undergo conversion therapy. The melodramatic emotional appeal to the state of emergency has become so routine that it is transferred to mundane aspects of public life, such as the appeal to a self-declared state of trauma, as opposed to that which is clearly medically determined, by students who use this as a basis for denying a platform to ideas with which they disagree, and who demand censorship of the literature and history curriculum at major universities. In a society that operates based upon a constant state of emergency, the appeal to individual trauma may be the last desperate gesture of the sovereign citizen to constitute itself, in Schmidt's terms, anew in an era of repeated violations of civil liberty. Schmidt's concept of political theology has had a long and troubled history in Shakespeare studies. For Carl Schmitt was not only a Nazi jurist, but an eminent Shakespeare scholar, whose legal theories blended in influential ways with his criticism. In Hamlet or Hecuba, the intrusion of time into the play, Schmidt's so-called decisionist approach towards legal theory may have given him unique insights into the way that concrete historical trauma intrudes into the very language and structure of Shakespeare's plays. Specifically, Schmitt read Hamlet as allegorizing the Tudor succession crisis and the world historical decision between Protestantism and Catholicism. Schmitt's paranoid alertness to historical crises that, for him, were a harbinger of a fascist redeemer, serves to remind us that Shakespeare's plays were not merely static aesthetic objects, but public events. Recently, critics such as Richard Wilson, in his book Free Will, Art and Power on Shakespeare's Stage, have employed Schmitt against Schmitt by exploring the progressive possibilities of such intrusions of history into aesthetics, charting its implications for the playhouse as developing space for Jürgen Habermas's public sphere, preparing the way for the very democratic institutions that Schmitt impatiently derided. Strangely, though, it is Schmidt's legal concept of political theology that has had perhaps the most lasting impact on Shakespeare studies through Ernest Kantorowicz's classic 1957 study, The King's Two Bodies, a study in medieval political theology. As Victoria Kahn points out, Kantorowicz's subtitle, A Study in Medieval Political Theology, almost certainly refers to Schmidt's book of that title. In his highly influential analysis of Richard II, Kantorowicz locates the sovereign's tragedy in the theological crisis that erupts when he is deposed from power, the violent separation of his divine body from his natural body. Kantorowicz's sweeping historical analysis places Richard's crisis not in the context of Schmidt's emphasis on the sovereign decision through the state of exception, but in the context of a larger process by which lawyers from the medieval period onward gradually secularized theology in order to consolidate the sovereign's power. Whereas for Schmitt, sovereignty must be embodied in a real person whose decisions have the theological significance of miracles. Kantorowicz's study points at the transfer of sovereignty to the individual, which implicitly valorizes constitutionalism and democratic institutions. And yet, Kantorowicz, a German Jewish immigrant whose book was published in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust, retains a troubled awareness of the Nazi connotations of political theology. Kantorowicz's solution is to claim priority for the medieval history he chronicles, which, he implies, has perverted the obsessions, weird dogmas, and idols of modern political religion, exemplified by European fascism, especially the Nazis. Kantorowicz's anxious relationship with Schmidt's political theology raises an important question for any consideration of this topic and for our conference. This is a consideration which Kantorowicz partially evades by avoiding Schmidt's decisionism in the state of exception. That is, not only does this discussion of Schmidt have a disturbing provenance, the rhetoric itself cannot entirely be liberated from its historical origins in fascism, as it has a tendency melodramatically to declare its own state of emergency, thereby reconstituting the critic as sovereign. Aside from the uncomfortable personal consequences of this can have the regressive consequence of contributing to the very affective contagion that feeds absolutism. Another problem, which Julia Reinhardt-Lupton has addressed in her 2005 book, Citizen Saints, Shakespeare and Political Theology, is that the discussion of the state of exception is loaded towards the drama of the sovereign. While this is appropriate, given the importance of the monarch as the foundation of state power in Shakespeare's work, Lupton self-consciously moves from that focus to valorize other personages, Shylock, Othello, Caliban, and Isabella. Other critics such as Victoria Kahn, Christopher Pye, and Richard Wilson, as already mentioned, have reconceived and re-envisioned the concept of political theology and the sovereign state of exception in a rich variety of progressive readings. And it is no wonder that there has been such varied and vibrant discussion of the state of exception in recent years. Shakespeare's plays seem obsessively to revisit moments of what Jacques Derrida calls non-law, in which what is at issue is the founding violence that establishes the right of the sovereign to govern. So in King John, for example, when the king prompts his loyal supporter Hubert to kill Arthur because the young boy's claim to the throne, Cardinal Pendle, the Pope's legate, succinctly describes the situation from John's perspective. That John may stand, then Arthur needs must fall. So be it, for it cannot be but so. Though Hubert loses the courage to kill Arthur, who incidentally dies jumping from a castle wall, Ken Jackson observes that Shakespeare comes dangerously close here to dramatizing sovereignty quite directly, sovereign power's origin in illicit violence. Or consider the implication of Bolingbroke's plucking of the crown from Richard II, or Prince Hal, very much his father's son, associated with Falstaff's thieves of the day's beauty, which he calls squires of the night, sort of euphemistically, but they are thieves of the day's beauty, as he prepares to assume the throne. Shakespeare clearly fought through sovereign power's strange ability to constitute itself through illegal acts. Consider also the Duke in Measure for Measure's perverse strategy of the imposition of a state of emergency through his appointment of a deputy, Angelo, who sadistically and mercilessly enforces strict statutes and most biting laws previously obsolete. Here, the law itself is used to demonstrate the sovereign's ability to undermine the law and to reconsolidate the power of the sovereign decree, quote unquote, which has become dead to infliction. Or consider the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice, in which the Duke and Portia perversely use the model of the state of exception imposed by Christ on the biblical law of the Old Testament as a moral justification for their anti-Semitism, demonstrating the difference of our spirits as a way to turn the seizure of Shylock's lands and his forced conversion into a bizarre and twisted act of Christian forgiveness. All of this is not to mention the more obvious example of Macbeth, who, as we know, discovers that sovereign power cannot be legitimized except through an unending series of murders, which we call the lawless olden time, ere humane statute purged the gentle weevil. The scope of Shakespeare's treatment of the state of exception and its examination of the origin of sovereign power is very rich and unexpected. His thinking is also profoundly relevant as we attempt to understand and resist absolute sovereignty in our own time and its attempts to reconstitute itself through a destruction of our civil rights. Today we have a real opportunity with this feast of papers on Shakespeare and the state of exception to think through this important issue using Shakespeare's political, aesthetic, and dramatic insights. It is my pleasure to welcome you, and I note this will be a truly important and thought-provoking conference. My hope is that these papers will provide us with the occasion for a running thread of commentary about both the formal elements of Shakespeare's work and also the model of Shakespeare's thinking. Formal elements of Shakespeare's work, but I also hope that we will use the model of Shakespeare's thinking to think through the truly exceptional events that have shaped our own time. Thank you.